Good morning, church. Good morning. Lots of conversation about superpowers, so good. There we go. Well, welcome. My name is Rod. I'm one of the pastors, and we are glad you are here this morning. So we're doing something a little different this morning. You were supposed to hear from our missionaries in Cambodia. And we got news this week as they were in the States that his mom was not doing well, and so they had to change flights and fly back on an emergency flight back home. So if you'd keep them in your prayers, that would be appreciated. I was really bummed that you don't get to hear from them because they have amazing stories. Both of them were taken prisoner in the kid prisoner camps of the Khmer Rouge. They both escaped and made their way to Thailand, eventually made their way to New York, got married together, and then decided to go back and minister in the city where that was the last stronghold of the Khmer Rouge. So think about it this way. It'd be like Jews escaping the Holocaust and then going back to the Nazi stronghold to minister the gospel of Jesus Christ. Just an amazing, amazing story. I'm sure you'll hear from them sooner or later. But we were kicking off really our missions push for the year. So we are going to continue to be fundraising this year for our ministry, Sustainable Ministry Center. And if you would like to go to Cambodia, we are doing a mission trip. I would invite you to come with me. I'm leading a trip in November 8th through the 18th. It is life-changing. I love it there. You're going to want to go. But we only have a limited amount of spots. So please sign up on the app. If you have any questions, see me, and we'll continue down. Now, here's what happens. We get the call this week that they're not going to be here, that we had them planned to give the message. So the question is, what do we do? Now, I'm a planner. I'm already working on my Christmas messages. I have most of my messages worked out through the year. And so as you can imagine, when you're a planner and then God has other plans, it can be really disorienting. I don't know who in this room is in the midst of that disorientation today. Maybe it's a medical condition or a friend or a spouse who has passed away, or maybe even moving communities or losing friends, or maybe being in a school and your favorite teacher leaves or you have to change schools. I don't know what that is for you, but the question I had was, well, what do we do today? So we're doing something very different, a bit out of my comfort level. We hope you enjoy it, but I'm just going to read out of the Bible. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to read out of the Bible. I'm going to tell you a story this morning about when God had other plans. And maybe you've never read much of the Bible. This morning, we're going to read a whole book of the Bible we're going to read through. So welcome to Story Time with Rod, I guess. We'll see how this goes. But I'm going to read out of the book of Ruth this morning. I'm going to read the whole book. But I want to give you a bit of an insight because you're going to need to know a few things as we get started. The first one is when God saved Israel and they became a nation, he gave all the land of Israel to the 12 tribes. Now, the trick is that the land mattered more than anything because it was their only economic source. Right? In order to have the land, they could feed their family, they could sell crops, they could do all of that. So God set up this system that they would keep the land even if you were a wife and your husband died, it would stay in his name. And they did that because what they didn't want was one family to have all the land and everybody else to become enslaved. God cares about his people. And so there was this idea that if I was a wife and my husband died, then my husband's brother would take me as his own, and then I would be able to have kids, and then my kids would one day eventually care for me, but everything would stay in the name, and that's called a kinsman redeemer. You're going to need to know that as we get started in the book of Ruth. The other thing about the book of Ruth is it's just a fascinating book. It's a bit different than most of the books in the Bible. One, because it's kind of in three acts, like a novel. There's heroes, there's villains, there's twists and turns. You're going to hear all that. And believe it or not, it's 85 verses, and 65% of it is all dialogue. Maybe that's because it's a story about two women. They like to talk a little bit. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean they do a lot of processing, right? They process. You're going to hear that. There's a lot of conversations going on in this book. But that makes it very, very unique. There's 6 prayers in the book of Ruth. And what's interesting is nobody's ever praying for themselves. They're always praying for other people. And throughout those 6 prayers, by the end of the book, all of those prayers come true, which is an amazing thing. So let's jump into Ruth, chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem of Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, they went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Okay, so we have to stop there. This is the time of the judges. It's a very dark time in Israel's history. They didn't have a king, and what would happen is they would fall into this thing called the sin cycle, where they would love God and then forget about God and drift away, and then another country would come in and take them captive, and then they would cry out to God, and God would raise up a judge, or think of like a president, and they would come out of captivity, and they did this sin cycle. Maybe you've been stuck in that cycle before, where you're taken captive by some sin and you're struggling and call out to God and God delivers you, and then things get really good and you kind of drift away. And so that was the time of what was going on. There also was a famine in Bethlehem. Now you're going to see that names are very important in this story. Everybody's name means something. And so Bethlehem means the house of bread. There was a famine in the house of bread. It's very ironic. It'd be like saying, hey, we went over to the Great Harvest Bread Company and nobody could find anything to eat, right? That's kind of the feeling of what's going on here. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Elimelech means God is my king. But what's interesting about that is if God is his king, why is he going to live in Moab? Moab was not a place for people of Israel to live. They worshiped different gods. They did different things. And I find it fascinating that things weren't going well, so a new job was going to be the thing, right? We're just going to move across the country. That'll fix everything. So often I think when people do that, what they don't think about is wherever you are, that's your community. He's moving to a place. Who are his wife's friends going to be? People from that area. Who are his sons going to marry? Women from that area, right? It's always been a thing for me as I have had to move for jobs, is to really think through what support do I want for my family, right? Who do I want? In fact, it holds true for us. We moved here. My daughter married a guy that she met here, right? Because this is where we are. This is the community we're in. And so to have somebody whose name is God my King, but just decides to go find something else in the land of somewhere that is not his king, is very interesting. Okay, so his wife Naomi, which means sweetheart, and his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion. Very funny names. They mean death and dying. It's like, hey, here's my 2 kids. This is swine flu, and Ebola, right? Like, that's a bit what it is. You kind of get the sense of what's coming down the pike for this family. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and husband. Okay, so this is a very dark beginning. About 10 years have just transpired in these first few verses. And we see Naomi, who left with a family, is now destitute. She doesn't have any land. She's in a foreign land, no way to make money, and all of her family is dead. She's a single woman in a foreign land. Things are not going well for her. So when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughter-in-laws prepared to return home from there, right? So she hears that the famine is lifted, things are going well, crops are growing again in Bethlehem, and she thinks, well, what am I doing here? I might as well go back to where all my cousins and families and friends, my hometown, I lived my whole life there. That's the place to go. So with her 2 daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. It's about a 50-mile drive. And when you think about it, it's not safe. These are 3 single women traveling on a road. It would have taken them about 6 to 7 days to get there. And this just wasn't safe. This wasn't something like us that we're like, oh, I'm just going to go to Pahrump for the day, and you jump in your car and you go. This is much different. This is a harrowing journey. It must have been desperate for them to need to get back home. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughter-in-laws, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as he has shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." The first prayer, she's praying over them. May you both find new husbands. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." So they say, "We're not going anywhere, we're going with you." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Remember, we talked about this idea that the land and people needed to stay within their clan. And so she says, what's the hope? Go back, find husbands. Go back to your mom and dad's house. Live there. It'll be fine. It really doesn't make sense that you would want to take this trip for me. And then she says these words, "The Lord's hand is against me." Now, what's fascinating about this isn't, man, things aren't going well for me. This is language that says this: the Lord is attacking me. The Lord is actively working against me. Have you ever been there, church? Right? Have you ever felt like, man, could anything else happen bad? Like, really, this is what's God? I've served you. I'm coming to church. I'm doing everything. And this is what's going on? This is what she feels like. This is more than just, man, things aren't going well. She feels like God is against her, right? Like somehow she's become an enemy of God and God is working against her. It gives you a sense of what she's feeling. And at this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." Right? So she says, listen, go back and serve your gods. Go to your family. Orpah's already left. Why don't you go back? But Ruth replied. Now, this is a great moment in time. What you see here, many people would call this Ruth's conversion, right? This is where she says, I'm following Jesus with all my heart. This is it. There's nothing else for me. I am here. Listen to how she says it. Maybe remind you of your conversion at one point. "But don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her, right? So Ruth is like, I'm all in. We're going together. Quit talking. Let's get this thing done. So the two women went on, and they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" Right here, she comes back. It's been a long time. She's been gone for up to 15 years, at least 10 years. And it's like, what is going on? Oh my goodness, can this really be her? My guess is she looked a lot older. She was pretty exhausted. Grief was wearing down on her. She had lost her whole family. And everybody that knew her growing up is like, this can't be Naomi. Is this Naomi? All the podcasts are doing podcasts, right? Have you seen the lady in town? We used to know her. She's not here. What's going on? And all of a sudden, she responds this way. Don't call me Naomi. In other words, don't call me sweetheart. She told them, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Right? Quit calling me sweetheart. Call me bitter old hag, because that's how I feel. Right? That's literally what she says. Like, she wants to change her name because life feels so bitter for her. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth and the Moabite. her daughter-in-law arrived in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. They land there early March, probably the first week in March. The barley is up. The barley season is happening. They're getting ready to harvest. And all of a sudden you feel like maybe there's hope for this family. Maybe something is going to go on. Now, let me give you a quick understanding of an economic truth back in that time. It was called gleaning. And here was the deal. So as the harvesters would go out and harvest, they would drop seed behind them. So they would go to the sheaves and they'd rip off all the barley and put it in piles, and it would fall behind. And God told them, listen, you're not allowed to go over the field twice. In other words, you can't go take it, and then you can't go back and pick up every little seed. You're just going to leave the seeds there. Some of them will seed, but most of them, if somebody is destitute, they have the right to everybody's field to walk behind and pick up the little pieces of grain. Now that feels weird, but that's just the way it was. God was like, listen, we need to provide for people who can't provide for themselves. So when you think about it, they would, oh, look at, I just dropped it too. This is a barley seed right here. And I know you can see that because it's so crystal clear. But think about it, that's what they did. They walked around and went, oh, there's one little barley seed and they would spend 8 to 12 hours in a field and get very little. Right? They just would gather up enough to make themselves some bread so they could survive. And it was God's way, because God cares about his children, all his children, that he could provide. So that's where we're getting. So they show up to Bethlehem, and Naomi is there. And now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man who's standing from the clan of Elimelech, right? So he's in the family name, and his name is Boaz. Favorite person in the Bible right here, minus Jesus. Boaz. This man looks an awful lot like Boaz. Didn't have an easy life. His mom's name was Rahab. She was the prostitute when there's a story in Joshua where they're coming into Jericho and she saves the Israelites. And so she lives with them, becomes part of the Jewish culture. Think about that. Here is a guy who grew up with a mom who was a prostitute, who was an outsider living in a Jewish land. Probably was a difficult life for him. But you know what we're going to see? That he turns it around. He's a small business owner. My guess is from this point on in the story, you're going to see that he does one thing well. He redeems women. And he cares for women. And my guess is that's because he grew up with a mom and he loved her and he saw how difficult their life was. Charles Spurgeon says this about Boaz. He says, Jesus is our marvelous Boaz. Because Boaz is a redeemer. And he's somebody who is looking to redeem everybody around him. Okay. I love Boaz. Can't wait to meet him in heaven someday. Okay. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor, right? This idea that, hey, I'm going to go glean. It's all right. I'm going to go do it. And Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech, right? Now, here's what it says. As it turned out. Many of your Bibles say it just so happens. Now, you have to understand this. The writers of the Bible are being very tongue-in-cheek. They don't believe it just so happens. Right? They believe God controls everything. In fact, the disciples, when they were picking the next disciple, they do something that we wouldn't do. We would say, okay, let's line them up. Let's make a pros and cons chart. Let's figure out who's the most equipped, who's got the best skill. They roll dice. Why? Because they believe God controls everything, even the roll of the dice. Nothing is left to chance. So I love it in here, we get just a quick glimpse. Most people just read over it. It just so happens, right? So she says, I'm going to go to a field, and Naomi says, go ahead. And so she goes out, she takes 2 rights, a left, goes straight on, and she just happens to land at the field of Boaz. Right? God, in other words, we're seeing God's hand behind things. I talked earlier when plans don't go your way. And when things don't feel like they're always working. Maybe you show up at a grocery store and it just so happens you run into a friend. or it just so happens that something works out. I remember when I went to Alaska and the housing crisis had happened, and it was 2008, and we had a mortgage that we couldn't sell because house prices were dropping, and I had a rental. And it just so happens that somebody just happened to start sending me Smith food cards so we could survive. It just so happened that people would show up and say, hey, Rod, God told me that maybe you could use a little bit of this. We went through a really difficult financial time, and guess what, though? God was providing. It just so happens. Don't forget that. Nothing is in coincidence. God is taking care of you even when you don't see it. Okay, back to the story. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvest. Now, listen, you're gonna recognize this. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. This is the priestly blessing that I say at the end, right? May the Lord bless you and keep you. My guess is this is how your bosses greet you. They come in and go, may the Lord be with you. And you all jump out of your cubicles like whack-a-mole and go, oh, the Lord be with you as well, right? That's usually the sentiment, but we see here's somebody who's following Jesus, right? Following God, and they know that, and they love him. It's the priestly blessing. Boaz asked the overseer of the harvester, his manager, he said, who's that young woman belong to? Sounds very innocent. You're missing the connotation. Hey, who's that? Right? How you doing? Right? Like that's the, hey, who is that over there? The overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. It's the woman you've been hearing all about, that she came back with Naomi. And look at that, she's a hard worker. She's got her head down, she's working hard, she's barely taking a break, and she's back there picking all the grain up. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, hi, right? There's this, all of a sudden, hope building in the story. Maybe this is a love interest, but he sure is interested. Listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the woman who worked for me. Watch the fields where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. This is an amazing sign of grace. We don't know where the well is. It could have been a mile, 2 away. She didn't have water. She would have had to work a little in the field and go get some water. But the workers had brought all the water there for the harvest, and he says, stay here. Think about this. If you were out gleaning and you were behind all these men working, the men knew one thing. You had nobody to protect you. No husband, no sons, nobody. You could have been taken advantage of. Some pretty dark things used to happen. And so Boaz is like, hey, stay in my fields and follow. I've told the guys you're going to be safe here. And if you need water, just come over here and take a drink anytime you need this. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. It sounds like maybe he understands some of that. May the Lord, here it goes, I love this prayer for her. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. He goes, man, I hope God repays you. And then he makes sure God repays her. How often in your life do you think you have one job or the other? Well, I prayed, so that's enough. Or maybe I'm supposed to make it happen. But what's interesting about Boaz in this story is he prays and then he makes it happen. Maybe the same thing for you, right? God, I hope that my family is taken care of. And God goes, man, that's a great prayer. Now go make it happen. I pray that Mosaic is equipped to do all the things they're doing. Thank you for Mosaic. God says, that's a great prayer. Now go give, right? Sometimes God puts prayers on our heart, and then we are called to answer those prayers. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, and though I do not have the standing of one of your servants. At mealtime, so we get a little later in the day, Boaz said to her, come over here and have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. She sat down with the harvesters. He offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave the order to his men. Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her and bundles and leave them for her to pick up and don't rebuke her. He gathers the guys up and says, don't touch her. You better be nice to her because I like her and I'm in charge of you. I love how he speaks to the young men. We speak to the men for a second in the room. We should be speaking to our young men, teaching them how to become men, how to be raised right, how to take care of women, how to do all those things. Women, I want to talk to you for a second. You should be mentoring young women, speaking into their lives, caring for them, right? This is what we're called to do. We are called a community. We're called a family, and we should be speaking in. And I love how he just makes sure they all know what's going on, right? Don't step out of line. Do what I say. And I love how he says, pull out some extra grain and leave it for her. Don't embarrass her. Don't do anything. Just go on. But from time to time, throw some grain down and let her do what she's going to do. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered. Okay, so I'm not a farmer. I think that bread comes from Costco. I don't know how all this works. But they would get barley, and then they would thresh it, they would crush it, and they would throw it in the air and let all the chaff go, and they would get down to barley. Okay, so she did that at the end of the day, and it amounted to an ephah. How amazing is that, an ephah? Can you believe that? That is shock. Could you imagine that an ephah would be what she would receive? Okay, well, She works for 8 to 12 hours. This is what she is deserved under the law. This is about what she would get, about 1 cup. This is barley, rolled barley. So there you go. That's about a cup. But she received an ephah. Let me show you what an ephah is. So amazing sometimes. We want what the law gives us. This is, God, this is what I deserve. Just give me what I deserve. I don't need the grace. I'll be okay. If you give me what I deserve, that'll be great. Yet God had other plans. God gave her an ephah. Amazing how God's grace pours out on us. In time, in talents, in treasures. And then when you think, that's a lot of grain, still goes. God just pours out his life. That's an ephah. That's amazing, right? It's about 60 pounds, 50 to 60 pounds, depending. That's a little shy. It was a 50-pound sack of grain, but you get the point. It just is an amazing, amazing thing. Unbelievable. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law, okay, so we read these little words. She carried it back to town. This is a strong woman. Working 12 hours. I had to carry that from my car into here, and it was heavy, right? She's carrying it miles, right? She wrapped it up like this in a piece of cloth and threw it over her shoulder. Good for you, Ruth. I'm like, man, I'm soft nowadays. We don't work as hard as they did back then. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over and hadn't eaten enough. So Boaz at one point said, here, take all the extra food with you when you go home. Her mother-in-law asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Another pray. I pray Boaz is blessed because of this. And Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "The man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finished harvesting all the grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who worked for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Okay, so think about it this way. There's a guy who owns a restaurant in Vegas. It's the hot happening place, and he's taking out the garbage one day, and he goes in the back, and he sees this woman, and he approaches her and says, "Hi," and she says, "Well, I'm just out here collecting cans to get enough so I can get something to eat." And he goes, "Oh, I recognize you. You're the person, I saw you at Mosaic Church. You're in those community groups. Man, you're doing the right things, and just, hey, why don't you come on into my restaurant? Here's an apron, put this apron on, and I'm gonna give you these tables over here. Because these tables, I'm telling you, those are the sharks, right? Those are the guys, the big whales, that they've got all the money. You just work for, you just wait on them." And she waits on them. And the end of the night, she has about $1,000 in tips. That's about what you're looking at here for one day. This would have been 1 to 2 weeks of wages for a wealthy person in town. And then he says, "You come back every day." And if she would have done that for the whole harvest time, she would have had enough to take care of her and Naomi. She would have had enough to sell and live a comfortable life for the whole year. That's how much Boaz was caring for her. And then the harvest festival is over, and you start to think, "Oh no, they didn't get together." It's the rom-com, it's the tension. Like, what's gonna happen? Is it all gonna be done? Stick with me. Chapter 3. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley in the threshing floor." So they're bringing all their harvest together. They're having a big festival. "Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Go then and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." Terrible advice. We don't advise our women to do this. "Hey, honey, wait until he's had enough to drink. He's had a lot of wine. He's laying down. And then go lay at his feet and say, 'I'll do whatever you want, my lord.'" Okay, well, sometimes we read there's prescription and there's description. This is descriptive, not prescriptive. Okay. "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Odds are there were no women on the threshing floor unless they were prostitutes. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are my guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter." I love his response here. You got to hear it. It says, "The kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do what you ask me to. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true, I am the guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as a guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here till the morning." What you may not have heard was just his response is, "Thank you." He feels like she's out of his league, right? He must be older, she's younger. He's like, you could go after all the young guys that are running around, maybe the richer people for me, and he just feels honored. So he's like, "Hey, I'll take care of this in the morning. Don't worry about it." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, "No one must know what a woman came to the threshing floor." Even here, he's caring about her character. He doesn't want it besmirched. He doesn't want any innuendos. He doesn't want gossip. He's like, you need to go home. He also said, bring me over your shawl you are wearing and hold it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, how did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. You hear that, young men? He's on a date. He says, hey, could I take a piece of chocolate cake to go? Gets it wrapped up, says, take this home to your mom. I know she likes chocolate cake, right? Like he's taking care. You can see, date your mother-in-law. Just a note for you guys. You got to, make sure your mother-in-law's happy. Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled. Naomi says, sounds like he's going to take care of it. Okay, chapter 4. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town's gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. I told you earlier that names are all over the Bible. They don't name this guy. This is what's-his-face, right? Like it's so funny how there's all these names and then there's what's-his-face, the other redeemer. And so here's what he does. He stands at the gate as everybody's coming out. And this is how they did things back then. As they would come out, he would pick elders from the town and he'd say, hey, could you all sit here? We have this legal matter we need to tend to. And then what's-his-face comes out and he says, hey, you need to sit down here for a little bit. So Boaz took the 10 elders of the town and said, sit here. And they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belongs to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am the next in line. I will redeem it, he says. Once again, tension. Somebody else has got the right. Is he going to do it? Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. So here's the deal. I love this, that Boaz doesn't manipulate. He doesn't lie. He doesn't cheat. He just gets to the guy and has a conversation. And when the guy's like, sure, I'll buy the land, that's fine. Then he's like, well, let me tell you the whole deal, right? And he highlights all the bad parts of the deal. He goes, well, you're going to have to marry Ruth, and then she's going to have a lot of kids, and your kids aren't going to have a lot of the treasure because you're going to have to divvy it up. It's going to water down your inheritance. Are you sure you want that? And the guy's like, no, I don't want that. Never mind. And he's like, good, I'll take it from here. And then at this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it for yourself, so I cannot do so. I'm going to skip down. There's this whole thing about sandals. They took off sandals, just a way they did things back then. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are my witnesses that I bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are my witnesses. The elders and all the people at the gate said, we are the witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel or Leah, who together build up the family of Israel, right? So they say, may she be renowned. May her name always be remembered. How important is that? I love this prayer because then we read, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. And then it ends with this beautiful picture, this story does. It says, then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. What a beautiful picture. Naomi, we start the story where they're in a famine and they leave and they go away and everybody dies, and then she comes back and we're not really sure, and then all of a sudden she is holding her grandson. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. I want you to see something. There's only 2 women in the Bible that are really, their stories are explained, that are in the lineage of Jesus. There's Boaz's mom and Boaz's wife. It's amazing to me that these faithful women get to be in the line of Jesus in a time and age when it was only mattered who the husbands were. I love how God is redeeming. And I hope that you got to see a little bit of Jesus in here, right? When we poured out the wheat, I hope you saw Jesus redeeming us. There's a family resemblance here. He came and he saw Ruth. He initiated a relationship with her. He spoke kindly to her. She found favor in his eyes. And then he shares a meal with her, right? Which is bread and wine. It's communion. He shares communion with her and then cares for her. Once again, I want to remind you of Charles Spurgeon, who said, Jesus is our fabulous Boaz. The book of Ruth. There you go. As we worship today and as we start to pray, I hope you can look upon this ephah of barley and just be reminded that God cares for you and he loves you. It's not it just so happened. That whatever you're going through today, when God is changing plans and when you don't see what's going on, God is working on your behalf even when you